Okay, so just to begin, my name is Nadia. I collaborate with Platonic Foundation, and we are here after a Convergence of Commoners Retreat, which has been in the Catalonian mountains and super nice. And so we've been getting to know each other for the past, let's say, I don't know how many days, 3 or 4 days. Yeah, yeah, I've lost track of time. But if you might be want to introduce yourself and let us know who you are, where you're based, and
So my name is Reema Patel. I'm based in the UK, in Cambridge, beautiful place. And in terms of what I do, I've been thinking about AI and participation in shaping AI and the role of people in shaping emerging technologies for the past 10 years or so. I run an organization called Elbon Social, and I work on issues of the digital good.
great. And Kate, if you want to tell us a little bit about yourself as well.
Yes, my name's Kate Beecroft. I'm originally from Aotearoa, New Zealand, currently hanging out in Europe. I've been working for the last 12, 13 years on designing governance processes for online communities. And recently I did work in blockchain space and designing governance for DAOs and now I'm leading something called the Science Fiction Economics Lab, where we use science fiction narrative and we combine it with economics to think way outside the possible about what could be and how we could actually get somewhere other than where we are now in society.
And just to start and orient ourselves, what we'll mostly be discussing is futures in technology, whether they're speculative or grounded in policy making. But Rima, what's your take on where we are with AI right now?
Well, where do I start?
Yeah.
I mean, the AI, there's two ways of thinking about AI. You've got the advent of generative AI, relatively recent since ChatGPT came on the scene, and then you've got what we call predictive AI. So generative AI is AI that is, multi-purpose, multi-use. Anyone can use it, and you can direct it to follow a particular direction of travel. There are all sorts of ethical risks and challenges around generative AI because it tends to come from data sets that are not quality assured. They're all over the internet, and we don't really know what, something like ChatGPT being trained on, and we don't really have the ability to say what's an acceptable use and what's not, and anyone can use it for any purpose they like. So that's one set of challenges. Then you've got predictive AI. And predictive AI is interesting because it tends to be less multi-purpose than used. It tends to be used for very specific reasons. And that's been around for a bit longer. So, there's a long-standing debate about things like facial recognition technology systems, that's predictive use of AI, but essentially the use of existing data sets about people's faces in order to identify and profile and use facial recognition technologies to flag up suspects. That's a predictive use of AI. There are, of course, beneficial uses of both. So lots of people using generative AI to support increased productivity in the workplace. A lot of people using predictive AI in order to be able to predict disease and diagnostic. My take is that we have exponential benefits potentially, but also exponential risks and challenges, and we face this sort of what I would describe as an Oppenheimer moment around AI. The risk is potentially if we look at the use of AI in warfare context and so on. The risks are high. It's a high stakes game, and we need to be alive to that and manage and govern and regulate it.
Okay. All right. And so Oppenheimer is a kind of narrative. I don't know. Were you a fan of Oppenheimer?
I think no, that's a whole other
Yeah.
question. I wouldn't describe myself as a fan of Oppenheimer.
Yeah.
I think that there is that sort of just to sort of context that awareness of so if anyone's watched the film Oppenheimer, you've got someone who is pursuing innovation
Yeah.
because they believe innovation is intrinsically valuable. In this case, it was the development of nuclear, and that's what he did. And then he spent the rest of his life concerned about the risks and the consequences of it. So I suppose you think about the Oppenheimer moment as the sudden realization that pursuing innovation for its own sake is not a good thing, that actually there are things to think about in pursuit of innovation. That's what I'm talking about. Yeah.
There's also the very interesting geopolitical aspect of this, which is it wasn't just Oppenheimer, it was the United States government and all the private powers that were driving that race. And I think we're seeing that with AI as well in a very big way, which has become really clear. Well, it's risen to the level of, the public interest a lot in the last few days with what's
Yeah.
happening in the States and who owns these AI. And Spain is doing something interesting with the ALIA model, which is obviously agents in the 4 languages of Spain, and that was like quite an interesting announcement on Monday.
Right.
And I think with the Barcelona supercomputer and different organizations around Europe, there is something growing around how do we build the European public interest AI and different large language models. So I think there is some leadership that could be happening here because we're up against some pretty well-funded forces, and competition law is kind of not helping us in this regard.
I would like problematize that a little bit because I think viewing it as this competition to beat out, let's say, American interests or innovation has led to, at least, for example, in the UK, like trying to lower, let's say, barriers to certain types of data in pursuit of innovation, which I think could be a little bit of a danger. And I think that there are certain digital rights at risk. I don't know if you might want to go into some of the digital rights at risk with like how we're pursuing AI currently, and if you want to elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think that if we think about the way we talk about data, it's a very convenient narrative to talk about data in a way because it masks from what data actually is, which is information about people. And the narratives around data suggest, like there's an Economist article that suggests that it's like the new oil, that it's to be extracted and exploited, and frames it as a kind of economic product when actually it relates to people and is about for people in society. And examples are, someone's face or someone's fingerprint or someone's genetic data or their genome. These are actually, types of data points that aren't just data points; they're people essentially, and the use and the governance of that is really important. When we're talking about AI, we are talking about ultimately data-driven technologies. So, as you pointed out, that relies on people and information. Of course, that generates risk of things like absence of privacy, but also surveillance. So Shoshana Zuboff have written about surveillance capitalism, where the human being is rendered visible and the human being's behavior is datafied. And we see that in really extreme ways when we see digital rights being infringed. Or as I like to think about it, just human rights have been infringed. They're not necessarily digital rights; they're human rights. But technology has amplified the power of organizations and institutions to infringe upon the way human beings behave, actually understand more and more about how human beings behave, and gather more and more data points and influence them. So you see that in ad tech. You see that in the sort of efforts to influence and control outcomes of elections. There's a really great book by Martin Moore called Democracy Hack, where he detailed how data is being used to influence the outcome of elections in Hungary, India, US, the Brexit election. Fantastic book. I really recommend it. So these are just some of the examples, and they're not just about digital rights, they're about human rights and they're about democracy.
Okay, so that's like, I think that describes a kind of bleak present, I suppose. Like, do you think about how this might look in the future, Kate? Like, how might we imagine differently, like whether through science fiction or speculative narratives? Like, what narratives interest you in reimagining the future?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of beautiful science fiction that does exactly this, right? when I think sometimes in social innovation and change process, we're quite limited in by all the constraints that are around us. Like, is this saleable? How do we get this through, regulation? Like, how do we get this through government? With science fiction, we can totally blow apart all those constraints. They don't exist anymore. And that's why it becomes a really powerful tool to imagine the future that we actually want. And then the economic part of it, and economics was famously called the dismal science, because it can be quite oppressive, right? There's these rules that were laid out in the 19th century that are very much about economics as kind of this science of from scarce resources, who gets what. The economic principles are around dividing up who gets what. So with science fiction economics, we go way beyond that. And we still use economics so that we're tethering it to our world and to society and to enable humans to live a rich life. But we break down this kind of trap of there is no alternative. We can't imagine to do something else with our digital future or with AI that doesn't play to the rules of the market or the neoliberal orthodoxy that we have currently. So there's some really interesting writing that's being done in science fiction, which is also can be used in this weird way as prophecy. And I don't know if any of you read Radicalized by Cory Doctorow, 2019. It was basically about people in the States who didn't have, they had serious health problems and they weren't covered by insurance. And what did they do? They did start murdering
Oh,
the
okay.
heads of insurance companies, which was incredibly prescient. So there's the predictive, prophetic aspect of science fiction economics, and then there's, this possibility space is extremely wide. And so in terms of what could happen with our digital future, that's a very interesting path that many writers like Dr. O, Yanis Varoufakis, others are going down, but there's also the Kim Stanley Robinson, who is kind of the master of thinking about our climate future. His most famous book is The Ministry for the Future.
Okay.
And this is interesting for someone like me who has been working in a lot of communities and movements and networks that, we're building for the future where the government is not our friend, basically. But in the Ministry for the Future, it's really interesting because it's actually some of the central banks that come to save us. They start to bail out the people and not just the corporations.
What is their motivation for bailing out people?
It's kind of like mutually assured destruction.
Huh.
That's their incentive. It's like, if we don't do this, we're going to enter into such big conflict that there will be no world. So yeah, there's a few things.
So what in terms of world building, for example, banks, like what for you is useful in trying to envision futures, whether it's like currency or banks or the future of education or the future of your phone? Like, what do you like to tinker with in terms of thinking about these futures?
I'm definitely interested in the financial economic part of it. Having worked quite close to the belly of the beast for the last 5 years in cryptocurrency, where I was coming from, community organizing, ending up on working with people that were trading, used to be traders on the floor. So learning from them about the instruments that we can use to get beyond scarcity is very interesting. Like, what I learned through working in DAOs and cryptocurrency is that value, we can create our own versions of value. And monetary theory kind of reflects that. Like, if enough people do believe that a thing has value, it does.
I don't know. Do you think that if enough people believe that a thing has value, it does? I think sometimes certain people's imaginaries and imaginations get more legitimized than others. And I think
So there's an economist called Robert Shiller who's written a really interesting book called Narrative Economics. I don't know if you've come across that book. And Robert Shiller won the Nobel Prize for this work very recently. And essentially he argues that economics has overlooked the power of narrative. But he also argues, I think, coming back to your question, that some people have access to more power and resources to make their stories heard and understood. And so there's this really interesting challenge, and actually cryptocurrency is a really good question, is who is shaping the future of cryptocurrency right now? My understanding is that a lot of that is being driven by already very, very powerful actors and stakeholders. And it's also a really good example because the idea originally around cryptocurrency was that cryptocurrency would democratize the money supply chain, but that's far from what has actually happened in reality. And there's a really good film called Banking on Bitcoin, which is worth watching, that really illustrates some of those dynamics between market and state and actors trying to develop and build a new technology. So I think what we can do is we can see cryptocurrency as an example of what happens when you have a technology, you have people with a vision, but then what happens is that these technologies get co-opted, and they get co-opted back into the status quo, and they become technologies that begin to reinforce the status quo and the power asymmetry that we already see in the status quo. Another example is actually that of the internet, which was supposed to be, a utopian vision that democratized information and knowledge for everyone. And Tim Berners-Lee very much had that vision for the internet. What we now see is not quite the sort of heady idealism that was characterizing the narrative and the rhetoric around the internet. So I think what we can learn from these things is, yes, narratives have impact and influence, but also that without strategies to address the risk of co-opting, things that aim to change systems will be at risk of being co-opted back into the system. Bill Sharp has a framework called the Three Horizons framework, where he talks about Horizon 1, Horizon 2, and Horizon 3.
Yeah.
Horizon 1 is the status quo. Horizon 2 is the emergence of new innovations that try to move towards Horizon 3, which is the just and viable world. And at Horizon 2, there are always forces that want us to go back to the status quo. And I think technology is a really interesting sort of medium way of studying that risk of being co-opted back, unless we are very strategic about how we get to the just and viable world.
Then what strategies interest you in shaping a more just world then? At like either a narrative level or a policy level?
Yeah, I think changing narratives about data and AI is really important. I think changing regulation is really important. So how do we kind of shape regulation so that it works for a broader range of people? And it's one of the reasons I'm so interested in democratization and participation is that I have very limited confidence in the ability of regulators and power holders to do that on their own. I think that it requires collaboration and the inclusion of people who are not part of the global governance and the national governance table to really move towards Horizon 3.
Okay. And so moving towards this other theme of justice, how do you think that does justice, is it a prominent theme in the science fictions of the future, or do you think how do you think it manifests itself in those spaces?
I mean, there's different types of science fiction. There's the dystopian, where no, justice is not really featuring. And then there's the more utopian, which is definitely a driving theme. And I think a lot of science fiction writers are attracted to write these worlds where things can be different and where people who are underrepresented or marginalized do actually start to have power. And so some of the strategies I've read about and seen is exactly what you were saying around how do we give people back some agency over how they make decisions about their own life, and how is that reflected in the design of the technologies that we're building, which is definitely missing from many of the examples that we were talking about before. And definitely cryptocurrency was co-opted in a really big way.
Yeah.
And I was there at that moment. We thought it was really the technology of governance. We thought this is going to enable us to participate like nothing else we've seen before.
Yeah.
And then in 2019, when it started to be very financialized and it became the technology of decentralized finance, we stood there with our hearts breaking
Yeah.
and thinking, no, but we can still use this. We're going to hang on. So 5, 6 years later, it's marginal. But yeah, I do agree that also regulation is really important for how we regulate these technologies. And it's funny, I was at a few years ago at a crypto conference with really like some of the people pushing for, who would probably be supporting Trump with monetary
Okay.
donation.
Yeah.
And there was this joke going around like, it's quite bad, but the only thing Europe's good for is regulation. But we should be proud of that. Like in
It's
Europe,
true.
like, and they were like, ha ha ha. But there's a lot to be like, we can do a lot with that. And the fact that there are still policymakers ready to do that and not just accept, a payoff to not do that is really important. And that's why we have to be very, very careful as we see some of the oligarchy that surrounds Trump come to Europe, like Musk, and
Yeah.
start to try to separate and divide the leaders of Europe, like what he's doing with Giorgia Meloni, who he wants to try to her to break the Iris satellite alliance, which is and for her to get out of it so that Starlink will get the policy, will get the mandate for that. So I think that the strategy is still around how do we participate together in democracy and influence our jurisdiction and our leaders, and also with AI. Litigation is still
It's like
very
most essential.
important.
Yeah.
Litigation, like there's many licenses that these models are using that are not open. And so there's a lot of potential for litigation that can stop
Yeah.
some. Yes, I'll let you talk
Yeah.
more about that.
Yeah, and I would like to give some examples of, I agree completely, and I would like to give some examples of what you're talking about. One is the European AI Act, which has been iterated and developed, but it is still the only regulatory framework that explicitly in the world aims to shape the AI market, shape the way AI is developed, identify the likely risk of the AI technology, and propose standards, and propose that the companies have responsibilities around the governance of that. Now, lots of people are very critical of it. They think it doesn't go far enough. They think
Yeah.
it shouldn't go that far, but actually it's still the only obvious
Farther than
framework.
most. Yeah.
Eh?
It goes farther than most, but I was of the opinion that it could go farther. For example, the facial recognition ban, certain bans
Yeah,
on using
yes,
profiling
absolutely.
technologies.
You look at the sort of way in which the regulation itself has been actually its original draft framework, and it's the way in which it had been watered down over time. I think it's actually a really interesting example of the Horizon 2 dynamics I was talking about earlier. So that's one really interesting example. One of the big challenges around there is sort of what is called AI nationalism. So you've got this regulation, the effort to shape how AI works and operates, and then tensions between the US's essentially deregulated stance to China's stance. So what we're really seeing is really interesting kind of geopolitics around this, which isn't actually that dissimilar to the nuclear war analogy that we all started off with. Just to link back to one of the things that you were talking about. Yeah.
So I'm gonna bring us to like maybe a last question of like how do you so I guess a question for each and I'll start with you, Kate. How do you think speculative science fiction, or let's just say science fiction, can save the world?
Um, I think that the process of doing it together, actually creating a narrative about a future we feel good about, doing that process and actually imagining what it could be like imagine if we had that, imagine if we did this, and imagine if in 2060 our lives were we were less isolated and we were more connected and technology was there alongside us without being this foe or this threat or this unknown quantity. So we can imagine these beautiful futures. And the part I love the most is like looking at what could be and then figuring out what is the work we need to do now to get there. What is the change we need to make at the policy level?
Yeah.
How do we make that change? And so through this process, we take economists, policy people, artists, technologists, and they come through this process, and usually it takes about 4 days. And then on the other side, they come out and they think, this is possible. Like the line that there is no alternative is false. And we have created this world that we have with the economic conditions that we have. And therefore we can very much create a new one. So this feeling of hope when everything seems very stuck and difficult, going through this process of like really speculating and like letting go of the shackles can be very inspiring for people. So I think if we all did that, we might have more chance.
All right. And then Rima, who do you think would have to collaborate, from policymakers to tech bros? Who do you think would have to collaborate to create these new narratives? Because you work with a diverse number of stakeholders. So even if it would be difficult to imagine policymakers wanting to participate in this kind of activity, who do you think, or what entities do you think would have to kind of get together to reimagine the world, to have these regulations that would better protect our interests?
I think the people who are not currently being served by the existing narrative. So who is being served by the existing narrative, and then who is not being served by the existing narrative. So the situation at the moment is such that you mentioned tech growth. Who are the people who are building and designing technologies for a just world, and their work in designing new narrative around their technology will be really important. And there are those people out there. It's just that they're not backed by venture capital and powerful investment. I mean, I've done research and I've been interviewing people who are building these technologies. Platonique is working, Destadine, civic data cooperatives, all of that is there. So that community exists. I talk to that community all the time. People, right? So and some people who are the most excluded from digital technology itself. That's going to be absolutely critical. So we're thinking about global north, global south power dynamic. Who currently is shaping the conversation? I mean, the European Commission, the US, and a very narrow part of the US policymaking decision-making process. So thinking about who is not part of those conversations is going to be absolutely critical. And that's why I think participatory decision-making matters a huge amount. It's hard to do, but we need to not rely on technology to do it, because if we rely on technology to do it, then there will always be people who will not be able to participate in the process. So it's a bit of a paradox. We need people who are not involved in technology to be involved in shaping technology that works for them.
Amazing. Thank you guys so much. And that is a wrap. Okay, now I will open. Would the audience like to participate in some way and share some opinions? Would you like to raise your hands? Olivier, yes.
I'd like to come back to the idea of inequalities, right? And maybe to recontextualize with the Convergence of Commoners Retreat, which the public is part of. And it's for both of you. So it's about AI, automation, and the commons, this magic world, which is not easy to operationalize. So how can artificial intelligence be designed and governed to serve the principles of the commons? And then attached to that, what roles does AI play in commodifying resources that were once part of the commons? And how can we protect or counteract this trend?
Do we collectively have an answer?
I mean,
Can you just paraphrase the question? So it's what role does AI play in shaping the commons?
Yeah. Or does it have a role in shaping the commons?
Does it have a role in shaping the commons?
I think one thing I've noticed in doing governance or designing governance, participating in governance in online communities where there is a commons, is a major problem we have is information asymmetry. It's very hard for people to make decisions where they don't actually have all the information. And it's very hard to design the architecture for that information to be readily available. So I do see a big role for AI in helping us with that, helping get the information to all the people that need it. I think that that's something some people are already working on, and I think that would be an immense help.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can think of users of AI that can serve or support the common, but working and very much led by human beings. So we had a really great conversation yesterday about the role of AI in facilitating or fostering empathy and connection and human understanding. I think there's also lots of really interesting potential ways of thinking about AI itself as a common. I also think that there are tensions and there are paradoxes there. So at the moment, AI feels like a very closed technology. So a lot needs to change in terms of AI itself. How can that become much more open and transparent? Can AI begin to explain itself and operate in commons type ways? But if I think about Ostrom design principles, no, you could imagine a world in which a group of people directed and used AI in order to support the creation of those design principles. It's a technology, it's a tool, so it's about how you use the tool to reach your outcome, and maybe that's the work that we need
Yeah.
to do as a group.
I mean, I find it really interesting in terms of, for example, I think it was the year before last, I did a citizen assembly in Madrid, and I found the most interesting responses in terms of how we might use or not use AI comes from people doing advocacy work at the border, because they are most intimately connected with its harms and have really great recommendations about its protections. There's also organizations in the States that do advocacy work around ICE that uses Palantir. And so I think that it would be interesting to incorporate those voices in the conversation.
Yeah, just a question, maybe following on from that, you mentioned that um, the potential of AI to explain itself, but also the challenge of how complex the technology is becoming. And so I just wondered if you had any further thoughts on it's difficult for public to participate in the design of something that they don't understand and that needs lots and lots of explanation to to understand what the options are, to understand how the thing functions and what could be different. Maybe same with economics as well. I wondered if you had any further thoughts on, is that just an impossible dilemma that the technology becomes so complex that people can't really be involved in shaping it? Or are there still ways that people can be involved in shaping and things in an informed way?
I would say I do not understand chemistry, or I don't understand how water becomes potable, but I do know I want potable water, right? And I think it can work in the same way.
Yeah, I think that that's basically the goal and the ambition of deliberative democracy, this kind of vision of there are things that we will not understand fully, but we can understand enough to be able to shape their direction of travel. So nuclear is hard for us to understand. Genome editing is hard for us to understand. AI is also really hard for us to understand. And yet there are these methodologies and these tools and these approaches. And we also need to design new methodologies and tools and approaches. And we need to invest in supporting people to understand because it affects them. So I think that's my answer is, if we find that it's hard to understand, that's probably because we've not invested enough in making it understandable and accessible and opening it up.
In regards to economics, yeah, it's hard to understand, but people know more or less, or they can think about what kind of growth they would like to see in their society, what growth means to them, what they think is a good metric of growth, or even value theory, what we value and why. I think these concepts can be broken down, and we instinctually know like how we feel about them. And I think it's on us to translate that.
So we're going to close this out, and I guess it's time for the next podcast.
Thank you.